Good morning. Yesterday, I was in Oxfordshire, standing in the aftermath of the devastation caused by a wildfire. Trees reduced to charcoal. Cars turned to burnt-out wrecks. The smell of smoke still lingering in the air on the site of what was once a thriving local business, now reduced to ash. Wildfires, literal scorched earth, and a looming sense, and I really want everyone to hear this, this is only just the beginning. And today, as temperatures fall at the end of yet another extreme heat alert, we know that if it rains now, the soil being baked dry means it's much more likely to flood. These days feel exceptional, but what we are living through right now are likely some of the least extreme summer temperatures we'll experience in our lifetimes. Today, I am sounding the alarm, and I'm laying out a plan. Because last week, while a wildfire the size of 200 football pitches was raging across Suffolk, I called on Prime Minister Burnham to act urgently to address the crisis. I suggested a COBRA meeting, being the very least he could do. And 6 days later, with another heat alert just having ended, we have still heard next to nothing from the very top of government. No emergency briefings, no new plan, and precious little detail about how this government will protect people from the crisis. It is putting lives and livelihoods at risk across the entire UK. So today, I'm delivering a reality check. We are facing the biggest threat to this country since the Second World War. I'm setting out what Prime Minister Burnham can do now to tackle the crisis, and I am challenging him to act with the urgency we need. You will hear today from those on the front line of this crisis, and they will lay out what they have dealt with in the past few weeks. And to them, on behalf of the entire country, I want to say thank you. Extreme weather is now the new normal, and without action, the impact on the people of this country will be unimaginably grave. The threats we face are threefold. First, the threat to the safety of the population. Almost 3,000 people have died from the effects of extreme heat this summer. And we know that older people and those with pre-existing conditions are particularly at risk from these dangerous temperatures. Those are the people who have been forced to stay at home for days on end, windows, curtains closed, trying to wait out the extreme heat. And these are the people who are most likely now to have grieving families, whose bodies were under such intense strain in trying just to stay cool that their kidneys and their hearts could no longer cope. Meanwhile, wildfires have seen hundreds evacuated from their homes, while many thousands more wait anxiously with flames on the horizon and smoke in their lungs. We've seen across Europe how bad things can get. Hundreds of thousands evacuated, 500,000 acres burned. The sheer scale of the devastation is hard to comprehend, but we need to look it in the face, because this is only a taster of what's to come if we don't act now. Second, we face a threat to our food and water security. Farmers are now warning we could see food shortages after flooding, followed by drought, has decimated crops. And despite farmers working really hard through the nights to avoid the heat, food production is grinding to a halt, and our food prices are set to rise. Half of England is experiencing serious drought, and across the country, 8 of our water reservoirs are at risk of running dry. Privatized water companies that have failed to build a single new reservoir since 1992 are losing nearly 3 billion litres of water a day from leaky pipes. That's 5 times more than a nationwide hosepipe ban would even save. The threat is so severe that the UK's National Risk Register warns that if we have 3 years of exceptionally dry weather like this, we could face water rationing. These aren't distant possibilities. They're very real scenarios, and they are coming straight at us down the track. Because finally, we face a threat to our very way of life. Parents, unable to take their children to the playground because the slides are so hot, it could burn their skin off. Temperatures so high, they keep us inside for days for the sake of our health. Cities feeling like ghost towns, parks turned into deserts. We only have to look across the channel to France and Spain to see what faces us in the years ahead. Europe is heating at twice the rate of the rest of the world. Wildfires, droughts, deadly floods. The scenes we have seen play out on our TV screens are frankly apocalyptic. And yet the response from our government is to pretend none of this is happening. It is an astonishing dereliction of duty from those whose very first responsibility is to keep all of us safe. And from the media, with some brilliant and notable exceptions, we have seen more clamoring for North Sea drilling in the last few weeks than actually raising the alarm on climate breakdown. While our country has come together, people have offered shelter to those who have had to leave their homes due to wildfires. They've checked in with older neighbours to care for those who are sick because of the heat. But the government have been far, far too quiet on what is an emergency. So today you will hear from some of those on the front line of this crisis and those with vital insights into how we face this threat. A doctor, a firefighter, someone who served this country in the armed forces, and someone who has dedicated his entire career to our precious nature and wildlife. It's experts like these that this government should be bringing to the table to design a full-scale emergency response. So I want to step out from this big picture and look at some of the urgent steps that Prime Minister Burnham needs to urgently announce to protect people right now and keep us safe from what we know is coming down the track. In the immediate term, we need to keep people safe from extreme temperatures. That means a free, accessible, cool space in every local area, and financial support for households so they can heat-proof their homes. Second, we need a robust wildfire prevention strategy, a fire service with the resources it needs to tackle blazes when they come. And that must include firefighting helicopters when needed, and not again ever seeing the shocking sight of requiring a charity to step in to contract a private firm to help fight fires. And this should all be funded by taxing the fossil fuel giants who are profiting from fueling these infernos. And finally, to secure our water supply, prevent droughts, and protect our food system, we need to bring water back into public hands. Right now, money is flowing out of our hands into the pockets of shareholders, just like water is flowing out of those companies' leaky pipes in the middle of a drought. Every single penny households pay for their water needs to go back into strengthening our infrastructure, building new reservoirs, and protecting us from the droughts of the future. We know that these extreme temperatures, these deadly wildfires, are being driven by the burning of fossil fuels. And the sad reality is decades of inaction, of politicians allowing fossil fuel companies to profit from pumping out deadly emissions, have guaranteed the extreme weather we are seeing right now, and we will see for the rest of our lifetimes. But there is still time to stop total breakdown. So let me speak directly to the Prime Minister. If we are to secure a livable future for our children and for our grandchildren, there can be no new drilling for oil and gas. On this, the science is crystal clear. As politicians, we have a moral responsibility to do what is right for the people we serve, even when it's not politically convenient. And I know that whatever our differences, we both care deeply about the people of this country and the future of our planet. So when the time comes, I hope you will have the courage to be truthful, be brave, and hold firm to your party's commitment to no new oil and gas drilling in the North Sea, including both Rosebank and Jackdaw. Now, some will say we can't afford to make these changes. These last few weeks are showing we can't afford not to. We are facing an existential threat. People are dying. People are scared. It is time to act. And when we do, we won't just avoid the worst effects of climate breakdown. We will lower bills permanently, help our communities thrive, and give a grounded sense of hope for generations to come. I'm so proud to be joined by 4 people who, in their own ways, have dedicated their lives to this country. And so first, I am absolutely honoured to introduce Carl Benfield, a former soldier, an engineer, who served in the Royal Engineers for 16 years, protecting the people of this country. Thank you for your service, and I'm delighted to introduce Carl Benfield. Carl.
Thank you, Zack. For 16 years, I served in the Royal Engineers and deployed on operations around the world, including Bosnia, Sierra Leone, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. I left the military in part because I grew exhausted watching successive governments make reckless strategic decisions while ignoring the existential crisis right here at home. As a soldier and an engineer, I was used to conducting threat assessments and defensive plans. It's clear to me that climate change is the single greatest threat to human security that we face. Removing climate resilience from our national defence and security agenda was an act of complete strategic blindness. You cannot defend a nation if you refuse to acknowledge the very force that makes its infrastructure obsolete, that burns its countryside, and that threatens its food and water supply. Since leaving the armed forces, I've put my engineering background to work to try and mitigate some of these effects, working in renewables, timber frame building manufacturing, and clean heating and cooling systems. From a technical standpoint, this crisis is entirely solvable. But more than that, transitioning to a renewables-based economy and climate resilience is a massive economic opportunity. It drives skilled domestic jobs. It fuels a healthy economy, and it shields our nation from the unpredictable chaos of global oil price volatility. Energy security is national security. So the engineering is ready. The economic case is clear. What we lack is bold political leadership. Zack's right. A government's first duty is to keep its citizens safe. Ignoring extreme heat and raging fires isn't just complacency, it's a dereliction of duty. We need an immediate Cobra-level response. We need climate change reinstated at the top of our defence and security agenda. And we need the bold leadership of Zack Polanski for our nation. Thank you. I'll now hand over to James Rogers, who's a firefighter in London. James.
When people talk about climate change, they often talk about the year 2050. I'm a firefighter. I want to talk about now. Because for firefighters, climate change isn't a prediction, it's a shift we're already working. Climate change is the fire call to multiple back gardens alight, children's clothing burning on the washing line. Climate change is the acrid smell as you effect entry into a flat because someone has succumbed to heat stroke and hasn't been checked on in weeks. Climate change is the sound of people in floods of tears when they're stuck in a lift, 20 floors up, in a 30-degree heat. Climate change is the taste of dust in your dry mouth, watching a fire sweep uncontrollably across a park you used to play football in as a child in your summer holidays. Climate change is this becoming a day-to-day reality. This week, I've spoken to my colleagues from all over the United Kingdom, and they have said, no one wants to admit it, but the heat is getting to all of us. We're getting shorter with each other, and we're finishing jobs feeling like we've done a full day's work, even before lunch. Another said, my station gets very hot inside, and there isn't a place I can find relief from the heat whilst at work. It leaves me having more headaches and brain fogs, less able to do my job. After 24 years in the job, another firefighter said to me, when are we finally going to get the workwear designed for this climate? Everyone who works in the fire brigade is feeling the exhaustion. We expect the fires. We expect the floods. We expect the road traffic collisions. What we didn't expect was for the extreme heat itself to become the emergency, not just for the public, for the people responding to it too. Climate change is rapidly changing the conditions in which every part of our job happens. Make no mistake, we will turn up. Don't fear the sound of our sirens. It's the sound of help on its way. We will keep responding. We will keep adapting. The question isn't whether us firefighters will do our job. The question is whether the rest of us are willing to do ours. The climate crisis is stretching the fire service long before it makes headlines. And whilst the same debates continue to happen, whilst fossil fuels are exploited from the earth for the profit of the few, our jobs are getting harder, days longer, resources thinner, and incidents more severe. Major fires can start with a single spark. Every solution starts with a decision to act. Every action that cuts emissions, protects our green spaces, teaches our children to care, supports resilience, or helps a vulnerable neighbour matter. Our future isn't decided by one big decision, but millions of small ones. And the longer we wait, the harder it becomes. For communities, for governments, and yes, for firefighters too. Because the climate crisis isn't coming, it's calling 999. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Dr. Veena Agrawal, a GP in Bristol and the Climate and Sustainability Co-Lead and Clinical Advisor at the Royal College of GPs. Thank you.
Hi everyone. The climate crisis is a health crisis. As a GP, I have been seeing firsthand the health impact of the recent heat waves. Ambulances are so stretched, we couldn't get an ambulance for a patient with sepsis or another one with very low oxygen levels because the ambulance service was completely overwhelmed. And indeed, the London ambulance service saw its busiest ever recorded day during the heat wave in June, on the 26th of June. That's even busier than during the days in the height of the COVID pandemic emergency. We're seeing people having more asthma attacks, having flares up of their chronic lung disease, so extreme they need to be in hospital, more people are having heart attacks, strokes, are having falls and collapsing due to the heat, especially those who are frail and more vulnerable. We're seeing people having mental health crises, which increase when there's a heat wave, and lots of people's kidney functioning worsening and needing to be hospitalised as a result. And this is an issue of inequalities, as the most vulnerable people, such as those who are elderly, people who have learning disabilities, those who are homeless, or have pre-existing heart and lung and kidney disease, they're getting very dehydrated and needing to be admitted to hospital. The hospitals are also completely overwhelmed. Many people are suffering from heat stroke, even just from being inside their houses, because our housing isn't set up for these temperatures. And people are becoming lonely and isolated because they can't leave their homes to go outside, and many activities are being cancelled. In addition, the NHS is not set up for these temperatures. GP surgeries and hospitals have seen failure of critical infrastructure, infrastructure for their IT, for their phones, and for operating theatres. Operations have had to be cancelled due to this in hospitals. And the buildings aren't designed for the heat, and this is leading to both patients and staff suffering from illness as a result of this heat inside of our buildings. The official data showed that an extra almost 3,000 deaths occurred within just 1 week in June during the heat waves. And that's almost double that was recorded in the season in 2025. In Europe, those deaths are 14,000 in that same period. We need to act now. The climate crisis is a health crisis. Thank you. Finally, I'll hand you over to a man who probably needs no introduction, broadcaster and environmental campaigner Chris Packham.
To the disappointment of many, football didn't come home this summer. But to the pain and suffering of millions, climate breakdown has. And our government and media response has displayed a total dereliction of duty in a time of extreme crisis. As we've heard, in May and June, there were 3,000 deaths attributed to the heat domes that have hung over the UK. Heat exhaustion, heat stroke, stress of heart and kidneys, and of course those mental health issues that you've just talked about. In Europe, the figure is somewhere between 14 and 20,000 up until the end of July, and it's expected to double by the end of this summer. So we're looking at maybe potentially 50,000 deaths across Europe. If these deaths had been the result of terrorism or a pandemic, the government would have cancelled its summer holiday, it would have held COBRA meetings, and there would be public information campaigns, the likes of which we saw during COVID, designed to protect us in this time of crisis. And yet, what do we get? We get rumours of possibly more drilling for oil and gas, and we get articles in the Telegraph which suggest that we ought to adapt to a Mediterranean climate. If that isn't reckless and irresponsible, I don't know what is. What we do need at this point is to listen to the science, not to the ongoing malevolent raft of mis- and disinformation that's perpetuated in politics, in public life, and certainly across social media. If we listen to the science, we see that the climate models that were devised in the 1990s have actually proved to be pretty accurate. But those who do try and transmit the information to us, people like the IPCC, which are often derided as alarmists by the right and the far right, have actually been too cautious. What we see, for instance, when it comes to the heat waves, is that they are occurring more quickly and more regularly than those models suggest. We're updating the science as it happens. What we also see is that it's not just a lack of water which is leading to the drought, although that might seem painfully obvious. It's actually being exacerbated by extremely higher temperatures. And that has an impact on the environment that I care so much about and we are all dependent upon. Across Europe, there have been across the world, there have been 35,000 wildfires. In the UK, there have been 66 major wildfires, but let's not focus on 66 because that sounds quite a small number. In one fire and rescue service, Berkshire, they've attended over 250 outdoor fires so far this summer. So the number of grass fires and so forth is going to be significantly higher than that, drawing upon an underfunded, under-resourced organisation at the front line of dealing with a crisis that is impacting all of us. So, lives have been lost, homes have been destroyed, businesses have been ruined. The clean-up cost Just look at Palisades in America. It's incomprehensible. We simply can't afford it. And then, from my perspective, the damage to wildlife, which has got scant mention, of course, because as ever we put human interest first because they're most immediate. And you might think, well, Chris is bound to bang on about the wildlife because he loves the birds and the bees. Yes, the birds and the bees, which form resilient ecosystems which allow us to produce the food that we eat. We have to protect nature in order to protect ourselves. So you might think, okay, the UK, the wildfires, they've all been out there on the heaths in Suffolk. They've been burning patches of heathland on the Isle of Wight. Not many homes have been destroyed. Well, the Ordnance Survey say that 1.8 million homes are at risk in the UK by looking at their maps and seeing which of homes are adjacent to areas which can, have significant wildfire risk. 1.8 million homes at risk. So far, compared to Europe, we've just got away lightly, and we've just been lucky. How many firefighting planes do you think that we've got in the UK? How many firefighting planes in the UK? 0. Exactly. 0 planes. Which is why, as Zack said, when that fire was burning at Dunwich, the National Trust had to hire a helicopter and pay for it to drag water out of the sea and dump on that precious piece of habitat, because there are no firefighting planes. Is there a public warning system in place which will tell people when there's a risk of wildfire so that they can be prepared to evacuate and have evacuation plans in place? Well, do you know what there is? It's available to the Fire and Rescue Service, but it isn't available to the public because it's deemed to be unreliable. Is it unreliable, or is it just a bit too scary? We couldn't even instigate a ban on disposable barbecues. Okay, there are the problems. What about the solutions? Because look, there's no point in just pointing out the problems. What we must do at this point is offer people real and accessible opportunities to be part of the solution rather than an ongoing part of the problem. Well, the first thing, we've already heard, we've got to enact far more rapidly that transition to renewable energy, for energy security, to reduce the cost of energy and its volatility that we've seen constantly across the world this year, which is having a significant impact not just on the cost of oil, but on the cost of living and global economic stability. It would also generate jobs, as it has in those countries that have invested significantly in those industries, most notably China. Talk of drilling oil, Rosebank, Blackbird, Jackdaw, is simply madness. We've got to just stop oil. We also need a transition in the way that we eat. This is integrally important when it comes to protecting the environment, everything that lives there, and ourselves. We need a transition to a plant-based diet. It's healthier for people. If any of you have had bacon or sausage for breakfast this morning, do you know that you've ingested a category A carcinogen, that's it, as toxic as tobacco? You may not. You may have just enjoyed your sausage and bacon. Why do you not know that processed red meat is actually really bad for you? Animal agriculture is responsible for 12% of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. It's also the leading driver of biodiversity loss. That biodiversity, that richness of life, that resilience in those ecological communities which we use to produce our food. We've got to change the way that we eat and produce that food, and we've got to provide sufficient support for farmers through that transition. And at the moment, they're not getting that. In fact, they're getting less and less, and their life is becoming increasingly difficult. We've got to address the mis- and disinformation, and we've got to do that with positive information campaigns. We've got to have people's minds on the front foot so they know what's true before they hear the lies. Then they will question the lies. Otherwise, we know what happens. If you tell a lie frequently enough, it eventually becomes the truth. And that's what we're suffering from. We can't afford net zero. We can't not afford net zero. And we're beginning to see that that's the case. We've got to sort out the media. I've been fantasising this year that we could perhaps criminalise climate denial. We should certainly criminalise irresponsible journalism. I've highlighted the Telegraph, but I'm going to leave you with something that I read on the BBC yesterday. How to survive a heat wave wedding. How to survive a heat wave wedding. Point number 5, beware of buttercream. This popular wedding cake ingredient is likely to melt if not kept cool. Likely to melt. A bit like my patience and all of our hope. It's time for bold, brave, informed leadership, and we're not getting it. We need Andy Burnham to step up before we and our only home burn down. Thank you.
Thank you. That was pretty powerful, and thank you to all the speakers for your contributions. I'm going to take questions from the media in groups of 3, starting off with Will Meakin-Durrant from PA. I think Michael will be coming over to you. Thanks, Will.
Thank you very much, Zack Polanski. When war in Iran broke out, you called for the government to cover an energy bill rise of about £300. That would surely amount to a subsidy for fossil fuel producers. Have you changed your position on this? And to do those sorts of step changes, you'll need a seat at the table. And yet your personal polling has dropped slightly. Geraldine Coggins didn't quite make it in Manchester. And Andy Burnham is in your sort of social media patch. So has your moment kind of been and gone?
Thank you, Will. Second, I've got Joe Pike from the BBC.
I think that might actually be
Thank you.
You're calling for no new drilling in the North Sea, but in a cost of living crisis. What do you say to people who are struggling with their bills? And isn't there a role for oil and gas while we transition? And a second quick one. The Conservatives are facing a lot of criticism for their selection of Joshua Bonehill-Payne as one of their councillors. Given that your party has also faced some criticism when it comes to the selection of candidates, do you believe in rehabilitation?
Thank you. Faye from Sky.
You're delivering this message at a time when Andy Burnham does appear to be having a Burnham bounce in the polls, largely at the Greens' expense. So are you worried about that? And in talking about the environment today, is this you trying to regain some credibility on an issue that some critics within your own party say you haven't really been talking enough about since you've become leader?
Thank you. So beginning with Will, I think you always need a short-term plan and a longer-term plan. If you look at Spain, they doubled their renewable capacity. And what that meant is they went from having some of the highest bills in Europe to now having some of the lowest bills in Europe. So in the long term, we absolutely need to be investing in our renewable capacity and making sure that we're transitioning to a much cleaner energy system. At the same time, if people can't heat their homes right now, that obviously has to be the emergency issue. So when the war in Iran broke out, that's exactly why I called for subsidies. What I think we really need to look at is the £2.7 billion that we're giving as tax breaks to the fossil fuel companies that we should be ultimately putting into retraining workers, for instance, and making sure that we have jobs for the future in renewables, in nature, in the caring industries. There's amazing skills in those communities that ultimately need to be harnessed. And what we can't do is keep telling people that we can keep drilling for oil and gas. I'm going to come on to jobs in a second, but it's important to say somewhere like Jackdaw, reports show that would be 27 new jobs. It's just absurd misinformation to claim that we need to keep drilling for jobs, putting aside the fact that we're having an existential threat to our planet. So, of course, we need to transition. On poll ratings, and it's similar to the question Faye asked, and the first thing I'd say is I'm really proud of Geraldine Coggins and the campaign that everyone ran in Greater Manchester. It's important to say that we upped our vote share by 80%, which I would say is a pretty impressive increase in a couple of years. On top of that, when you look at every single borough in Manchester, there's one borough where we remain the same in vote share. In the other 9 boroughs, we increased, and in many substantially. So I think there's really, really strong growth there. I think it's also important to recognise the context that Prime Minister Andy Burnham is having a honeymoon, and good luck to him on that. He was a very popular mayor of Greater Manchester. He's become the Prime Minister. He's doing announcements every single day. I think you as the press will be the first to acknowledge that there's often very little substance to the announcement, and we're going to have to wait until October to see what happens at the budget. Look, taking my leadership role aside, I'm also a citizen of this country. I want this government to do well. I want them to lower bills. I want them to tackle the climate crisis, the nature crisis. And if they do all of that, then yes, that might make things harder for the Green Party. But I welcome that, because then what we can do is focus on making things even better. And I think my biggest achievement, or one of my biggest achievements in my coming up to a year of being leader of the Green Party, was toppling a very unpopular Prime Minister. I'm in no doubt that if we had not won Gorton and Denton, Keir Starmer would not have had the leadership crisis he had, and we wouldn't have had the version of Andy Burnham turn up that criticises neoliberalism. And obviously I very much agree with that, and that's something I've been talking about all year, and something the Green Party's been talking about for decades. The criticism isn't enough, though. If you criticise the problem, but don't offer the real credible solutions to change that problem, then people will ultimately get sick of you. And I think what I really hold on to is ultimately we have truth on our side. Because if Andy Burnham kind of wants to keep kicking things into the long grass and talks about drilling in the North Sea, for instance, reality will catch up on him. So I hope he does the right things. And if he does the right things, then we'll focus on what he can do even better. But all the evidence so far, including the appointment of Shabana Mahmood, not putting Ed Miliband, I believe, where he belongs, some of the continuation of some dire policy, including in relation to Palestine, I think points to a Prime Minister that wants to say the right things but isn't willing to back it up with action. To be fair, he's pretty new. Let's wait and see. On the North Sea, I think I've partly answered that. I think the important thing here to say is that if we decarbonise by 2050, that would cost less than a single energy shock. And we've now had 2 energy shocks in just a few years. So the first thing to say is we cannot keep waiting. We cannot keep hoping for magic technologies. The technology already exists. What is lacking is the political will to overcome barriers. Those barriers aren't even particularly strong. They just require leadership. And we often talk about how to invest in things and the bond markets. And it is important to recognize that we need to take the bond markets with us. But one of the ways we do that is by having a clear plan that is visionary, that people can get behind. Now, that clear plan clearly has to tackle inequality in our society. It clearly has to tackle the jobs crisis and making sure that we're tackling unemployment. But it absolutely has to have climate and nature at the heart of it. These are the fundamental risks to us as a civilization. If we don't have nature, we don't have anything. Everything collapses. And I thought Chris's phrase was brilliant. Like, you can obsess about the birds and the bees, but actually what you're obsessing about there is, one, nature in itself, which is intrinsically important, but also, even if you take the most selfish perspective, we need those birds and bees. We need those pollinators. We need those food and ecosystems to survive and exist. On councillors, I don't know the individual circumstance of this individual councillor, so I'm going to be careful about wading in on a case that I don't know the detail on. But I do believe in rehabilitation. I think someone can say something or even do something and make a mistake. Now, I think the important point is that we don't just apologise and move on. There has to be a clear recognition of what they did wrong and what they're going to do in the future to rectify it. I don't believe anyone should be pushed out of public life permanently. I do believe that there has to be spaces for people to rehabilitate, no matter what they say or no matter how heinous what they do is. I think there clearly has to be a relationship, though, between a candidate, whether that's for a councillor or an MP, and the voting public, that ultimately they have to re-earn trust. And again, it can't just be a meaningless apology. It has to be a clear direction that the lessons are going to be learned. To Faye, the first thing I would push back on before answering your question directly is that I've been talking about the nature and climate crisis from the day that I was elected as the Green Party leader. And I've been in so many interviews where people have said to me, you're not talking about climate and nature. And I've said, please ask me a question about it. It would be my absolute honour, and I would delight in being able to talk about these things. What I have done, and I think is key to your question, is link the climate and nature question to the issues that people are talking about every day. Now, I wish people were talking about the climate crisis every day, and that's partly why I've called this press conference today, because I've seen over the last few days and few weeks the shocking scenes of wildfires, the number of 3,000 deaths. It's a number that can just kind of get said, but I think we need to sit in that 3,000 people have died because of the extreme heat. And I recognise the platform I have as leader of the Green Party. I recognise that we have 230,000 members. I recognise that our polling was higher. It's still much stronger than it's ever been. And I recognise that with that platform and with that moment, I want to draw attention and do everything we can to push the Prime Minister to take action on what is such a crucial subject. Now, I've focused on the climate and nature crisis today, but we already heard from our guests as well that this does link in. This is a way to lower bills. This is a way to transform some of the inequality in our society. This is a way to create the jobs of the future and to make sure we have more cohesive communities. So I don't think we can or should talk about climate and nature in a silo. I do think there are times, though, when people have died and we know that more heat waves will come, and we know that next year we could have even more extreme temperatures, that there's a moment to say we can put the cost of living crisis to one side for a moment. We really need to talk about climate and nature, but it is important to keep linking it back and let people know if they're worried that the climate crisis is going to be off the backs of working people, I'm worried about that too. It does not need to be that way. We need to recognize that BP have doubled their profits during the Iran war. We've got Barclays who've gone up a third in their profits, who are advising some of their clients to say that they can profit in the extreme heat. That's egregious, it's grotesque, and it needs calling out. And what I would say to the press and the media in the room is I can call it out as a political leader, but I think you also have a role to call it out. And I know some of you do, and so this isn't blanket calling the media one thing. We have journalists doing brilliant work. But the amount that we hear about whatever Nigel Farage or Reform want to talk about, and the little we hear about the climate and nature crisis is pretty glaring. And so I hope this moment can be a reset where we can talk about the really important things more. Thank you. I've got Alita Adu from The Guardian.
No?
Just over here.
Thank you. Mr. Polanski, Parliament's in recess right now. As you rightly say, over the last few weeks, thousands of people have died, and we're seeing severe droughts. Why have you waited until now to deliver this so-called, reality check to the government? I mean, you have been on major platforms. You have a major platform yourself. Are you struggling to make this a defining sort of issue for your leadership instead of what it seems to be as your mishandling of your social media accounts? And just on the Tory candidate, if I may, Joshua Bonehill-Payne led a sustained campaign of anti-Semitic abuse against Luciana Berger. As a Jewish party leader yourself, do you really think that Kemi Badenoch's defence of him was right? And finally, just to be a bit cheeky, the chair of the EHRC has accused a number of Green Party-led councils of being performative by refusing to implement the law on single-sex bases, given she says they will essentially be obliged to follow the law. What's your response to that?
Thank you, Alita. Bethany Dawson from LBC.
Hi. Mr. Polanski, a full-scale approach to climate change and indeed many of the other big political issues of our time require cross-party work. Are you happy to work with other parties, and do you accept that that might mean apologising to other party leaders when mistakes are made? And a reduction in North Sea oil and drilling has seen oil being shipped just from third-party countries, thereby raising the carbon footprint and price of oil. Do you think that that is right? Are you happy to see that? And again, just to be cheeky, taking inspiration, do you think that Ed Miliband should be the Chancellor?
Thank you very much. And David Williamson from The Express.
Thanks so very much. Just following on, a question which came up a lot during the Aberdeen South by-election was that while gas still has a role in supporting renewables and the energy transition in Britain's energy mix, and when there's genuine concern about the potential for Russia to target the country's supply lines, is it better to import gas from Norway or to transport LNG from the Gulf or the United States rather than taking North Sea resources? It has also been great to know if you share Mr. Packett's idea that climate denial should be criminalised. And just also, it's a very fraught time, as you'll be fully aware, in British politics, especially in the wake of tragic events. I mean, has a diktat been sent out to Green supporters and activists and members that violent imagery, such as the use of guillotines, is both dangerous and unacceptable, and just simply as, I suppose, a gesture of goodwill and lowering the tensions that we see in the country, Would an explicit apology to Nigel Farage, is that something that you would like to do?
Thank you. So, Aletha, to come to your 3 questions, I realise that 3, it's all multipliers, it's about 9 questions now. The first thing I'd say is that I haven't chosen today to start talking about the climate and nature crisis. In fact, I spoke about in my speech, I called on the Prime Minister to call a COBRA meeting. It wasn't just this Prime Minister, though. Very often with Keir Starmer, I would call out the fact that they weren't ruling out new drilling in Rosebank, for instance. We know that there's been some trickery in language from the Labour government in terms of the manifesto, in terms of what is called new oil and gas. There's also this idea of tiebacks. I think we just need to be really clear that there cannot be a role for new oil and gas in the North Sea, no matter what mechanism you might try. Now, that is not me just saying that as a political statement. That's a geological statement. We know that most of the reserves of oil and gas in the North Sea are going to go dry. So when they say to workers, oh, we're protecting your jobs, this is about the jobs of the future in the North Sea, that's just a lie. There will be no future jobs in the North Sea. What we need to be doing is investing. Now, this links with 2 of the other questions slightly. This is not about turning the taps off on oil and gas overnight. This is recognizing that we need to do this transition. Now, the best time to do this transition would have been decades ago. In fact, we could go further back than that, when the fossil fuel companies literally knew the effects and the damage that they were doing to this planet. They sat on the report, they sat on the information, they sat on the science. So that would have been the best time to do it, was to notice when we were destroying the planet. We can't rewrite history, but what we can do now is treat this with the urgency it requires. And so what today is a step up in urgency. I have been calling for this. I'll continue to call for this. And very rarely do I talk about housing, for instance, without talking about the fact that we need passive house standards. All that means is, that the houses are the right environmental standards, so they're insulated properly and we're not retrofitting them a few years later, that they're warm in the winter and cool in the summer, which is obviously very relevant to our conversation right now. Anti-Semitism is an incredibly serious subject, and as you say, as a Jewish person, it's something that affects me directly, affects my family directly, and there can be no place for anti-Semitism in our society. That's the same for any form of hate crime or any form of discrimination. It's also true that someone can say things, and I'm not saying this happens in this individual case, when people are younger, when they're a teenager, when they're on social media, and I don't think people should be held to the standard of what they might have said years ago that they no longer believe. What I do think is a problem, though, for instance, is Nigel Farage with the stories around hissing gas chambers at young people when he was when he was a kid in school. We've had several reports of those, and I don't think he's ever quite denied it. He just said no harm was meant by it. Now, I think if he apologized for that, or if he recognized that wasn't the right thing to say, then that's a different conversation. I think what I'm more interested, though, is what are people's views today, particularly if they're standing for election. What do they believe? What are their values? And how do they act? And I'm most concerned not with what's going on in their heads, but what's happening with their behavior. And so I think there's an active question about Kemi Badenoch's candidate, about what do they believe now, how are they acting now, and do they recognize what they said was wrong and why? And again, I don't think that's just about saying it was wrong. I think there has to be a deep recognition of what it is. I think 2 things can be true at the same time, that anti-Semitism can be totally intolerable in our society, and we can extend compassion and forgiveness even to those people who disagree, or even those people who have shown hate towards us, if they have genuinely learned and rectified. And I think that is nuance, but I think we need nuance in our politics. Talking about nuance, the EHRC guidelines. I think these guidelines have been unworkable from the very beginning. And we know that trans people have been deeply concerned about what has been a pretty constant hate campaign towards them, to the point where the only kind of coherent response, I think, to seeing what is happening in relation to trans people is that some people just don't want them to exist in society at all, or to have a place where they can go to the toilet. I think the very obvious questions is how unworkable this is for businesses and service providers, that if you're asking people to provide a third space at all times, how are you funding that? Not to mention the fact that third space is pretty discriminatory against people in terms of how they identify. I also think it's very obvious that if you run it through its full conclusion, is a trans man now meant to use a cis woman's bathroom? That clearly wouldn't be acceptable to almost anyone in that situation. So I think it's clear that the guidelines are unworkable. What I'm much more interested in then is yet another culture war, or yet another example where trans people are harassed or victimized or treated badly, or frankly where cis women feel like their views are not being heard. I want the government to actually come up with a plan that is workable, that recognizes that we can both and must respect the right of women, where we have a huge issue with violence of women and girls in this country, but to note that violence against women and girls often comes from a partner or someone in the family and not a trans woman, and to recognize that we must respect trans people's rights to be able to go about their daily business and their daily life. I think all of that is possible when you move aside the culture wars and actually listen to people and make sure that we bring workable guidance. But the idea of creating guidance that's unworkable and saying to everyone, off you go, good luck, that's clearly not okay and it's not acceptable. Bethany. There we go. Bethany, you asked me about, you're going to have to repeat the question, I'm sorry. Got it. Yes, absolutely. I'll work with anyone who wants to tackle the climate crisis and wants to protect nature. This issue has to be above party political kind of, this issue has to be above parties. It has to be about how do we protect people, how do we protect the planet, and how do we lower people's bills. Now, at the same time as saying that, two things can be true at the same time. Vested interests have really corrupted this debate. Most obviously from the Reform Party, who I believe between 2019 and 2024, 95% of their donations came from oil and gas companies or climate-denying companies. So if you have a party taking that much money from the vested interests, it becomes very difficult to believe that when they speak, that they're actually representing people's best interests and the planet's best interests, as opposed to their pockets or the pockets of their donors. That doesn't stop at the Reform Party, though. The Labour Party took £4.1 million from Quadrature Capital, asset hedge fund with links to oil and gas companies, also arms trade companies, gambling companies, and private healthcare companies. So when it comes to the climate crisis, but we can talk about any issue, there is a huge conversation to have about political donations, how they work, and how we make sure that people ultimately are serving the constituents who elected them and represent them, or who they're there to represent, rather than vested interests. And I see that run throughout this entire conversation. On Ed Miliband, ultimately that is a question for Andy Burnham in terms of who he appoints as his Chancellor. I am worried about John Healey. I think the fact that we had someone who resigned under Keir Starmer over defence spending very explicitly and then has now been made Chancellor suggests that I don't think we're going to learn the lessons of defence spending. What are those lessons? I think when we talk about defence, we need to look at it much more widely and talk about security. Yes, military spending is important, and just as importantly, particularly right now, is spending against cybersecurity to make sure we're protecting our cybersecurity, spending against if there's another pandemic and making sure we're resilient, and of course the climate crisis and nature crisis. That is our security and that is our defence. And I'm really interested by the conversations that Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez is having in Spain right now, where he is saying to NATO that part of the number that we're spending in terms of our defence spending has to include climate and nature resilience, because ultimately, as we've said, that is the greatest threat to our country since the Second World War. And I can't remember your third question. Yes, I think I've answered that, which is about making sure that we have a just transition. That includes wind and solar. People will often say that, it doesn't blow all the time and it doesn't shine all the time. That is true, but what is also true is it's predictable, and there are ways of using technology, both through battery and also demand supply, and making sure that we're building a coherent, variable energy supply that uses different ways of doing things. This is not about shutting off oil overnight, but it's recognizing that actually we don't need that oil in the long term. And I think there's something here about patriotism, about recognizing the sovereignty of our country. That's British wind, that's British sun. We could ultimately be harnessing the power that we have in this country. And of course, the wind doesn't just come from Britain, it travels as well. It's important to say that, but recognizing when we have the technology that we create and the science that we create and those jobs of the future, that's a way of really harnessing pretty much what the war spirit was and the Marshall Plan, of saying what does it look like to invest in these technologies, to put ultimately the whole country on a war effort, where we're thinking about in every single industry how can we be lowering bills, making things more efficient, and adding our contribution to tackling the climate and nature crisis. And I think that's really exciting. And David, from The Express, I guess it's the same question again in some ways. I'll try and find something different and something new and interesting to say on this. I think there's a real question here about standing up to Donald Trump. And I was pretty disheartened to see Andy Burnham responding to Donald Trump's call for more drilling in the North Sea and oil and gas by not ruling that out and talking about pragmatism. And it does feel like pragmatism has become the new code for difficult decisions, because we always see difficult decisions for disabled people, for migrants, for trans people, for people who are unemployed and trying to get on the job market. We very rarely see difficult decisions for fossil fuel companies, for multimillionaires and billionaires. And I think there's a conversation to be had. Should fossil fuel companies be earning or making a single penny of profit at the same time as we're seeing these disaster crises? I think there's a conversation to be had about every single penny of excess profit that those fossil fuel companies making going straight into wildfire prevention, straight into tackling the climate crisis and climate adaptation. It makes me sick to think of people like James and firefighters who are going out bravely and doing that work to tackle these wildfires, to put their lives in danger, while we know that burning fossil fuels is what is making these wildfires more intense and more frequent. Yet some firefighters are not always going to the scenes in the correct equipment. There was a whole conversation particularly about women firefighters and the fact that when the uniforms weren't gendered, or they didn't have enough uniform for women firefighters, they were having to wear the same as the men, these heavier uniforms, that meant when they were in dealing with fires, the exact moment where you'd want their brains and their thoughts to be on nothing but how to tackle the fire, they're in the uncomfortability and dangerousness of what they're wearing. Now, I don't blame the fire brigade for that a moment. What I blame is austerity and so-called difficult decisions or pragmatism from successive chancellors and governments who have not taken this issue seriously. I also know that the Fire Commissioner, I've heard him say this many times, would want a statutory duty on the fire brigade for tackling wildfires, and more so floods. It's not right that when there's a flood, in particular, governments understandably turn to the fire brigade, various fire services, and say, you know how to deal with this, off you go. So they have the ability to be able to do that, but because it's not a statutory duty, they don't have the funding and they don't have the resources that they need in order to be able to do that. That, again, is grotesque, and it's very obvious how you fund it. You fund it by saying to fossil fuel companies, you will not make profits off the back of people's misery, off the back of wildlife being destroyed, their habitats being destroyed, off the back of local businesses being destroyed. You will not profit from that, and that money is going to go straight to the Treasury to make sure that we're going to tackle future climate catastrophes. Finally, we've got...
I'm really sorry. We are out of time. I'm really sorry, everyone. We have to go. But thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate you making the time and coming all the way down here. Thank you very much.
Apologies for my long answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.